Hello, I'm Dr. David Clark. I lecture in theology at the University of Roehampton in London. The title of this podcast is Theology and Identity. In this episode, we want to look at some of the main theological questions related to the idea of Messiah in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, there are different dimensions of Old Testament Messianic theology. One aspect of Messianic theology is eschatological. The Messiah comes in the last days to conquer evil, to reward the righteous, and to establish eternal peace on earth. Another aspect of Messianic theology is soteriological. That is, it has to do with salvation. Many passages talk about the Messiah as the one who makes atonement for the sins of Israel and the sins of the nations, and thus opens the way for a new level of relationship with God. A third aspect of Messianic theology is missional. That is, it has to do with how does the Messiah help Israel fulfill its mission. We know that Israel has been called to receive the blessing of Yahweh and to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. They've been called to be a model people that will draw the world to worship Yahweh. But reading through the Old Testament text, we've seen how badly Israel has failed to complete this mission. So the question around the missional element of Messianic theology is, how does the Messiah help Israel fulfill its calling to be a model people and to be a blessing to the nations of the earth? So once again, these are the 3 points we'll look at today: the eschatological element of Messianic theology, the soteriological element, and 3, the missional element. Now, as we look at these points, I want to remind you of the methodology that I'm using in this first series as we're working our way through the Old Testament. As much as possible, I'm trying not to read the Hebrew Bible through the lens of the New Testament or through the lens of Christian theology. Christian theologians will often encourage us to read the Old Testament through the lens of the cross. That is, to interpret everything we read in light of what we believe about Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that that's bad or wrong, but that approach does have its limitations. We must remember that insomuch as we're talking about the original intent of the authors, the Hebrew Scriptures were not written to us. They were written to the people of Israel so that they might understand the will and the character of the God with whom they had established covenant relationship. In the Old Testament, a story unfolds. Our aim in this series is to put ourselves in the shoes of the people for whom that story was being written. We want to build our concept of God around what has been revealed in that narrative, and we want to block out any future events or texts of which those characters would have been unaware. All this is to say that in order to understand the power of the narrative, we want to be conscious of what the people of Israel knew and what they didn't know at these various moments in time. So let's begin talking about eschatology. What does the Messiah do for humanity at the end of the age? In Hebrew thought, one of the key elements within Messianic theology is that the Messiah would reestablish the kingdom of David on earth. We remember that in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God made a promise to David saying, "When your days are fulfilled, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." Now, while David thought that God was talking about Solomon, we know from what happened later that Solomon was not the guy. We talked about the sordid details of Solomon's life back in episode 8. So on a very basic level, we know that for the ancient Israelites, from the time of Solomon forward, there was an expectation that someone would come from the line of David to reunite, restore, and rebuild the kingdom of Israel. Now let's talk a little bit about how the history unfolds. As the centuries passed, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah spiraled deeper and deeper into sin and chaos. We've noted in our last two episodes that the prophets came to help Israel understand how far they had fallen, how deeply their sins had hurt God, and also to warn them that judgment would come. And that judgment did come. The first kingdom to fall was the northern kingdom of Israel. In 722 BC, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V swept down upon Israel, destroyed their cities, and carried them away captive to various regions of the Assyrian Empire. These exiled tribes never returned, and that is why they're often referred to as the lost tribes of Israel. Now, down in Judah, there was a prophet at this same time named Isaiah, who was prophesying that Judah and Jerusalem also would be destroyed. And this happened 200 years after the life of Isaiah, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem at the end of the 6th century and carried the people into captivity. Isaiah had predicted that the house of David would fall, and it happened in dramatic fashion. Now, here's a little bit of the story about the end of the line of David. The last ruling king of Judah was a guy named Zedekiah. When Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, made his final assault on the city, Zedekiah and his family tried to escape. They made it as far as the plains of Jericho, but they were captured. The Babylonians brought Zedekiah and his sons before Nebuchadnezzar. Right before the eyes of their father, his 2 sons were slaughtered. Then the Babylonians cut out the eyes of Zedekiah so that he would spend the rest of his life with the memory that the last sight that his eyes beheld was the slaughter of his own 2 sons. So this is how the line of David comes to an end. Isaiah had predicted that this moment would come, but Isaiah had also predicted that miraculously, somehow, some way, the line of David would be restored. In chapter 11 he wrote, "There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit." So here we see in Isaiah 11 the image of a tree that has been cut down and perhaps burned. The stump lies there dead, but there comes a moment when out of that dead stump a little shoot comes forth, a little branch appears. Isaiah is saying that there will come a time when out of that line new hope would emerge. And as we read through Isaiah chapter 11, we get a clearer picture of who this man will be that comes to restore the line of David. In verse 2 it says, "The Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him." In verse 4 it says, "With righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth." In verses 5 to 9 it speaks of universal peace that comes to the earth. The wolf lies down with the lamb. No one will hurt or destroy anyone. The earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In verse 10 it says that in that day the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for all the peoples, and the nations will gather around him. And in verses 11 to 13 it says he will regather all the tribes, Judah and the 10 tribes of the north, from the places to where they had been scattered. So this is that eschatological element of the Messiah. He comes to restore the nations. He comes to reestablish the line of David on the earth. And he comes to rule forever. Now, the next aspect of Messianic theology that we want to look at is the soteriological work of the Messiah. That is, how he makes atonement for the sins of Israel and for the sins of the nations. There were 2 prophets who had a lot to say about Yahweh's coming atonement for the sins of Israel, and these men were Ezekiel and Isaiah. If you listen to the episode entitled "The Broken Heart of God," you'll recall the graphic passage that we looked at in Ezekiel 16. Here, Yahweh allegorically portrayed himself as a husband who had been deeply wounded by the sordid sexual sins of the woman that he had married. And in this allegory, that woman was Israel. But at the end of this dark and depressing passage, Ezekiel also prophesied of a time when Yahweh would turn the hearts of the people back to himself and renew the covenant that he had made with them. It says, "For thus says the Lord God, I will deal with you as you have done, you who have despised the oath in breaking the covenant. Yet I will remember my covenant with you in the days of your youth, and I will establish for you an everlasting covenant. Then you will remember your ways and be ashamed. I will establish my covenant with you, and you will know that I am the Lord, so that you may remember and be confounded and never open your mouth again because of your shame, when I atone for you for all that you have done, declares the Lord." And Ezekiel chapter 36 speaks in a similar vein. Beginning in verse 24, it says, "I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness, and from all your idols I will cleanse you. And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh, and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and be careful to obey my rules. You shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God, and I will deliver you from all your uncleanness." So these passages in Ezekiel speak of a coming time of restoration and renewal for the people of Israel. But they don't really say a lot about how this will happen. There's not specific mention of a person or a Messiah who will be key in bringing this transformation about. And that's where the prophet Isaiah comes in. In Isaiah chapters 40 to 55, there are a series of passages where Yahweh speaks about the coming of a person called Avdi, my servant. When we juxtapose the servant passages in Isaiah with what we've seen in Ezekiel, it becomes clear that this servant is Yahweh's instrument of atonement for the people of Israel. This is particularly clear in the famous passage that runs from Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12. Here are some verses from that passage. It says, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." And then further down it says, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge will the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he will bear their iniquities." Now, as we try to understand this text in its original context, our primary understanding is that it's talking about the redemption of Israel. But there are also clues in this passage that the Messiah comes not only to make atonement for the sins of Israel, but for all the nations. For example, in 52:15, there's the image of cleansing the nations through a sacrificial offering, where it says, "He shall sprinkle many nations." But we really see this idea of the universal character of the Messiah's atonement in Isaiah chapter 49. In that passage, Yahweh is speaking to the Messiah, to the servant, and he says, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." So here we see, again in Isaiah 49, that not only does the servant, the Messiah, come to make atonement for the sins of Israel, he also comes to make atonement for the sins of the world. This is the soteriological work of the Messiah. He comes as the one who will turn the hearts of the people back to God. He comes as the one who makes atonement for their sins and who brings about the redemption of the nations. So thus far, we've talked about the eschatological element of Messianic theology. We've talked about the soteriological element of Messianic theology, and now let's talk about the missional element. In the passage that we just read, Isaiah talks about the servant as a light to the nations. But where does this leave Israel? We thought they were supposed to be a light to the nations. They were supposed to be the model people that would draw the world to worship Yahweh. Does the Messiah replace Israel in this regard? Does he take over their mission because they have failed so badly? Or could it be that Israel still has the responsibility of fulfilling that promise that had been made to Abraham? Let me illustrate what I'm trying to get at here. Let's imagine that together with my 5 children, we agree to make a gift for my wife Kimberly on her birthday. So one of the kids is going to turn a vase on the pottery wheel, another is going to paint it, another is going to fire it in the kiln, and the others will make beautiful silk flowers that we're going to put in the vase. My job will be to coordinate and support the 5 kids in the process. But let's imagine that the whole project goes awry. Some of them drop out, others don't try very hard, and along the way they're all fighting and arguing with each other. So the moment comes for me when I, as the father, have to step in. And the question is, what approach do I take with my intervention? If I feel that they just don't have the ability to take on this project, should I just do it all myself? Or should I hold on to the hope that maybe they still do have a chance to do this? Maybe I should sit them down and address the problems. Perhaps some of them need additional training and I could give them lessons. Maybe I find that some of them are lacking motivation, and so I give them a pep talk. And then I try to figure out why they're fighting and arguing, and I try to reconcile them. So in the first approach, I'm just replacing them. I'm taking over the task myself and getting the job done because they weren't able to do it on their own. In the second approach, I'm trying to restore them and get them back on track. I still believe that they have the ability to complete the task, but they need my intervention and my support to get the job done. So again, it's either replace them or restore them. Now, thinking about the Messiah in the Old Testament, which of these options best aligns with what the text says about the work of the Messiah? Does the Messiah come to replace Israel and accomplish on his own what they were unable to do? Or does he come to restore them so that they can fulfill their purpose and mission that was given to them by God? Is it replace or is it restore? Now, there are definitely some passages in the Old Testament that suggest that God is going to take matters into his own hands. In Isaiah 63:5, for example, it says, "I looked, but there was no one to help. I was appalled, but there was no one to uphold. So my own arm brought me salvation, and my wrath upheld me." In this text, there is the sense that Israel was completely unable to become that model people. They were unable to be the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, so Yahweh sends his servant the Messiah to do for Israel what they could never have done for themselves. He just replaces Israel. But that's not the complete story. Other passages in Isaiah suggest that the people of Israel aren't just playing a passive role in the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. In Isaiah 60, for example, Yahweh speaks to the people of Israel, saying, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you, and nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around and see. They all gather together. They come to you. Your sons shall come from afar, and your daughters shall be carried on the hip. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you." And a similar idea is expressed in Isaiah chapter 62, where it says, "For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not be quiet, until her righteousness goes forth as brightness, and her salvation as a burning torch." Speaking to Israel, it says, "The nations shall see your righteousness, and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name, that the mouth of the Lord will give." So the key point in these passages is that Yahweh has not replaced Israel with the Messiah. He does not just bypass them in order to fulfill the promise that he had made to Abraham. So let's circle back to the questions that we were asking in the beginning. Does the Messiah replace Israel, or does he restore Israel? Does the Messiah take Israel's project and do the work on his own, or does the Messiah come to build and heal Israel so that they can be the light to the nations? I think what we're seeing is that it's a little bit of both. It's something like this. Israel alone can bring salvation to the nations, but Israel cannot bring salvation to the nations alone. We've seen in the Old Testament narrative that many people in Israel tried to keep the covenant, and throughout the narrative, many individuals did keep the covenant. But on the whole, the 12 tribes of Israel failed again and again. So this left Yahweh with a problem. In order to fulfill the promise that he had made to Abraham, blessing to the nations must come through the seed of Abraham. There's no way around this. But Israel has been a complete failure. So where does Yahweh turn? He turns to the Messiah. The Messiah first comes to turn the heart of Israel back to their God. Then, together, the Messiah and the redeemed of Israel collaborate to bring the blessing of God to the nations. And in this way, the promise given to Abraham is fulfilled. Now let's reflect on all of this a little bit. The title of this podcast is Theology and Identity. And what I'm trying to understand in this particular series is how the ancient Hebrew understanding of God shaped the way that the people of Israel viewed themselves. If I were an ancient Hebrew living, let's say, in the time of Isaiah, this is what I might say about theology and identity. First of all, I would reach the obvious conclusion that there's something deeply wrong with me and wrong with the people of Israel. Looking back over the history of my nation, I would have to acknowledge that when presented with the path of life or the path of death, covenant faithfulness or rebellion, the natural instinct of my people has been to choose the path of rebellion. At the same time, however, I would have to acknowledge that my God, Yahweh, is deeply invested in me and my community. Despite the fact that we failed him again and again, God is not giving up on us. I have the deep sense that he loves me and that he has an emotional need to be in relationship with me. He has a calling and a purpose for my nation, and he is absolutely determined that one way or another this plan is going to be fulfilled. For me, again imagining myself to be an ancient Hebrew, the meaning of the Messiah is twofold. First, he deals with the problem of my sin and failure. But second, he restores my dignity and he restores my purpose. The Messiah invites me to work in partnership with him and with God to fulfill God's purposes on earth. The Messiah is the redemptive agent of God at the same time that he is the missional activator of the people of Israel. So in conclusion, let me share some thoughts on what this means for us today. What I see here is that the spirituality of the Hebrew Scriptures drives us towards authentic partnership with God. He has chosen to work through people in order to accomplish his purposes on earth. Could he have designed the world in such a way that the accomplishment of his will and purposes was solely in his own hands? Of course. But the message of the Hebrew Scriptures is that this is not the world he chose to create. What I see in the Old Testament is that he wants to work through us. And so ancient Hebrew spirituality is not a groveling in worthlessness and helplessness, nor is it the spirituality of a person who can do things entirely on his own, some form of deism. Hebrew spirituality speaks of relational intimacy, of friendship, and of deep connectedness and collaboration between humanity and God, so that his purposes on earth may be fulfilled. And that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you so much for joining me today. I would love to hear your comments and feedback, and I hope that you'll come back and listen again.